I think I became aware of segregation probably earlier than most African American children in my generation. Uh, One of the reasons for that was I became involved in a lot of different academic competitions, that sort of thing, really as early as about 6 years old. So I was actually venturing outside Louisville's segregated black community, whereas most of my contemporaries were not. In a way, I was aware of a world outside the world I lived in, much more so than many of the kids I grew up with were. And my family had been involved in various ways with what we would now think of as civil rights or racial uplift kinds of movements as well. So I'd hear some of this in the home. But in general, what I remember most was a world in which everybody was black. And, it was a very vibrant world, one that felt very safe, at least the part that I lived in, but a community that I now, in retrospect, understand was also rapidly changing. For example, when I was in elementary school, scarcely a week would go by that some new kid would not pop up from Alabama or Georgia or Tennessee. This was the last phase of the Great Migration, as we know now. Of course, all I knew was that these kids that talked funny, as we said, and dressed funny and so forth, would turn up in school. But we were also aware, I was born in 1949, so right before I started kindergarten, the Brown decision was handed down. And just as I was entering public school, the forces that were going to change a great many things in American society were just beginning to be unleashed. And so, most of my childhood unfolded against the backdrop of that. And it made it a fascinating time to grow up, but also a time when there was kind of a constant level of tension. And there was always sort of this sense of conflict, not too far removed from where we were. But more than anything else, a sense that things were changing. And, of course, during that era, there was the sense that things were changing for the better. Well, you could become aware of the world on the other side of the color line, so to speak, in a variety of ways. If you think about how Louisville was structured residentially in the 50s and 60s, the African American community was not just one place. It was several neighborhoods. And sometimes just traveling between one of those neighborhoods going to another, you would go through a part of town that was all white. Or if you went to downtown Louisville to shop, that was all white. Now, sometimes you could go in a store and try things on and buy them. Sometimes you had to buy things without being able to try them on. There were different degrees of exclusion that you had to learn to deal with. Of course, the theaters and those kinds of things were all segregated on 4th Street. That was the big strip back then. When I was about 13 years old, the Public Accommodations Ordinance took effect, and all that desegregated. But I can remember going to one of those theaters the Saturday before the ordinance took effect and being turned away. Next week I could go and walk in. They didn't like it, but I could walk in legally. But you were never so far removed from that. Louisville was not so big that you could be isolated or insulated from it. The other factor was urban renewal. I grew up in the Russell area at 24th and Madison Street. And when I was very young, if you were to go west to 30th Street or 31st Street, west of that line, everybody was white. By the time I was in high school, west of that line, just about everybody was black. And so I could ride my bicycle, for example, from home to Shawnee Park. I used to play tennis and basketball. And I could ride my bicycle down Madison Street, and of course it would turn into Vermont at 31st because all the street names changed at 31st. This was the way from early in the last century that whites wanted to create kind of a dividing line between the black neighborhoods and the white neighborhoods. So Madison would become Vermont. What was then Walnut Street would become Michigan Drive, and so forth. All the street names would change. And as I would ride west, when I was 12 or 13 years old, I'd go through neighborhoods that were just about all white. By the time I was 14 or 15, just about all the whites were gone. And so, we were very, very much aware of that. We were aware of it in school and academic competitions and athletic competitions. And, of course, you had television and you had the newspapers. So, it was not something that we were insulated from in the sense of being off in some little rural enclave. We were very much aware of what was on the other side of that color line. If I was to ask someone why I couldn't go to this store or why I couldn't go to this theater, as I look back on it, the responses that I got from my parents and even from teachers and other adults that I respected were very interesting, because the focus was typically on the fact that basically those people have a problem. And, and if they don't want you there, then there's something wrong with them. Other kids would get responses that would sometimes make them feel like they were the ones that had the problem, and that's why they weren't going to be able to get in. But, my folks always took the position that, anyone that doesn't treat you like you're as human as they are, they have the problem, not you. I actually went to 3 high schools. That's an interesting experience, too. I was in a special program coming out of the 8th grade. It's a long story, but I'll try to abbreviate it. They did a citywide test of 8th graders, and students who scored highest on the test were invited to a special summer school that was held at St. Agnes, as a Catholic elementary school. And they flew in teachers from all over the country. There were 100 of us, and there were about 4 of us who were black. And they really pushed, in a sense, the notion of going to Catholic schools. So initially, I wanted to go to a Catholic high school coming out of that, but I stayed at Russell, which is the junior high school that I attended, because I was going to play basketball and do a lot of other things. But I started high school, to make a long story short, at St. X. And because of the hassle in terms of bus rides and, of course, no girls, and I came in sort of a funny place, because having been in the advanced program in my own junior high school, I was actually ahead of most of those kids at St. X, even though most of them didn't realize it at first. So I was taking courses with juniors instead of with sophomores, and then I was taking religion courses with freshmen, because I'd never had that kind of stuff. So it made me have to go to school a half hour longer a day, screwed up the bus schedule, the whole 9 yards. So I wanted to transfer from there, and there was kind of an unwritten quota as to how many black students could go to predominantly white high schools then. And I wanted to go to Male, but I couldn't get in Male because Male had its quota. And so I ended up going to Atherton for the rest of my sophomore year. Then I went to Male in my junior and my senior year. Folks were very comfortable with some of us being good, as athletes and all that, but they were not comfortable with us being good in the classroom. I had a lot of interesting experiences out there because of that. Stereotypes work in funny ways, and none of them really are valid, but they do weird things to people's thinking once you buy into them. And a lot of people just seem to resent the fact that I even existed, because I could do better in class than some of them could, and just a real strange kind of thing. It's interesting. I had more trouble with teachers than I did students. I had a couple of teachers who almost seemed to want to make it their mission to make my life uncomfortable. I'll get sued if I get too specific here, probably. But one in particular who, after I made an A in his class once, this man had a picture of a chimpanzee on the inside of a door. And this was a first period class, and if anybody yawned, it's early in the morning, he'd open it up and point to the chimpanzee. Now, I'm the only black kid in there. And he'd make little references to Africa and Africans and so forth. And I got an A in the first grading period in his class, and I think it sort of surprised him. And the next grading period, he was determined I wasn't going to get another A. And when we took the final test for that grading period, he wanted to deduct points from my test because I didn't start my answer on the top line of the paper. Now, all the answers were right. He wanted to take points off because the first one didn't start on the top line of the paper. So I said, oh, no. So next thing I know, I'm on the bus getting kicked out of school. And had another teacher who, I write poetry, so I don't write it much anymore, but I used to. And this is a class where I finished my work fairly early, and I'd stare out the window, and write poetry while other students were, finishing their work. And this teacher felt that was showing some kind of disrespect to her. And she actually knocked my books and stuff on the floor. And I left them there, and I walked right out of class. Next thing I know, I'm on the bus going home again. And so that's one reason why I didn't go back there in my junior year. And it's interesting, too, because I became a merit scholar in my senior year. And some of those same teachers at Atherton that gave me such a hard time wanted to claim that they had made me what I was. It was the damnedest thing I'd ever heard. And of course, the people that really, did the most in terms of my own educational development were in my own family or in the schools I went to when I was younger. But it was an interesting experience. As I look back on it, it definitely prepared me well for what I've had to deal with in the years since then.